Brian's Hunt by Gary Paulsen. Chapter 9. At first he thought they were just gone, perhaps back to a town for some reason, although he knew they hated cities as much as he did. But no dogs barked to greet him, and there was no noise at the island. No sound, not even birds singing. By the time he pulled the canoe up on shore next to one of their canoes, a thick glass-hulled 18-footer, he knew something was wrong. As he pulled in, the dog jumped from the canoe onto the land but did not leave him, did not run up the shore. She stood near him, pressing against his leg while he tied the canoe to a limb. He took his bow and put his quiver over his back and knocked a broadhead in the string and thought, all right, crazy as this is, I'll just take the teasing if they walk up already. From the beach where the canoe had been tied, a track curved about 15 yards to a camp area, and he could see they had constructed a cabin about 15 square feet with unpeeled logs and a tarp for a roof pulled over a ridgepole to make it peak and drain off water. But no people. All right, they were gone. That was too bad. But they would come back, and the door to the cabin was open. It was made of 3 rough planks chopped from soft pine and hung on leather hinges. He thought he could see that much when he was 20 yards from the cabin, but it stood open, and they would not have left the door open that way. The dog stopped, her nostrils flared, and all the hair on her back went up in a thick ridge, and she growled in a low, steady rumble. Brian put his 3 pulling fingers on the bowstring, ready to draw and release, and moved closer to the cabin. Then the smell hit him. Not smoke, not wood smoke, but the smell of blood. Musty, rotten smell of spoiled blood and flesh. He stopped again, flaring his nostrils, taking the offensive odor in, trying to see all around and up and down at the same time, holding his mouth open and his breath to hear. And that was when he heard the sound of flies. All right, he thought. All right. They left some meat here, and something broke into the cabin and got it and let all the flies in. And it was all wrong. So wrong. He had never felt anything so powerfully wrong in his life, and everything in him wanted to run, get away from this place, but he knew he had to go on. Go in the cabin. He stood to the side of the door, 8 feet away. Anybody in there? Then, to the woods, more loudly. Is there anybody here? Nothing. Just the continued buzzing of flies, no other sound, and he stood another second and a half, nervously fingering the bowstrings, and then he took a deep breath, held it, and stepped into the cabin. There were no windows. The only light came through the doorway and the dim glow that worked down from the tarp roof, and for moments he stood inside the doorway, virtually blind in the sudden darkness. Then he stood aside and let the light in, and at the same time his eyes became accustomed to the darkness. My God. The words slipped out without his knowing or caring. It looked like a bomb had gone off inside the cabin. Sacks, boxes, sleeping bags, bunks, snares, traps, and provisions were torn open, thrown everywhere, ripped open and flung in piles like so much garbage. But no people. They had gone somewhere, maybe in a plane, and probably a bear had gone into the cabin, and indeed, he saw slash marks on a sack of flour that could have been from bear claws and torn into everything. But no, that was too easy. There was more than a part of him, and a part of him knew it. Knew there had to be more, though he didn't want to admit it, and he saw then what he had missed at first. The flies. There was a buzzing of flies everywhere, but the sound was deceptive because the flies were all back in the corner where torn sleeping bags covered something. Brian moved to the corner and with no breath left now, only fear. He reached for a corner of the torn sleeping bag and pulled it away and saw the body. A human body, doubled up and jammed back in the corner, covered. It was Cogwadush's father. David, destroyed, face torn, neck torn open, one arm ripped half off the body, stomach torn open. Ah! Brian turned and instantly vomited, almost hitting the dog, which had followed him into the cabin, growling openly but crying and whining as well, looking at the dead man. Oh my. He couldn't think, couldn't react, couldn't do anything except stand and throw up and try to make what he had seen not exist. It couldn't be. It just could actually be. Not this terrible thing. But he turned back and David was still there, in a cloud of flies, and a part of Brian's brain went on automatic and saw things he could not stand to look at, could not bring himself to openly acknowledge. David was dead in the corner. It couldn't be, but it was. He was there and torn terribly apart. It had to have been a bear. A bear, a rogue bear, had broken into the cabin suddenly and attacked him and overpowered David and killed him. He had fought, or tried to fight. There was a rifle, a 30-30 in the corner by the body, with the lever pulled open. David had tried to load it, and the bear had come so fast he hadn't had time to get a shot off. Perhaps the gun had been in the corner and the bear had burst in and David had tried for it, and the bear had gotten him first. What of the others? Where there was David's wife Anne, and the little boy and girl, and Susan, Cogwadosh. Oh God, he thought. Oh God, what of them? Where are they? He turned away from David. There would be time later for what was necessary there, and looked through the rest of the trash in the cabin, turning over paper and bags and bunks. There was no other bodies. Outside then. David later, but outside for now. There had to be a sign. He had missed things coming in because he was nervous. There must be a sign. Tracks. When he went outside, he was appalled at how much he had missed on the way to the door of the cabin. There, in the soft earth on the side from the hard-packed trail down to the lake, were clear prints of bear. A large bear. A huge bear. The prints had to be nearly 6 inches across, and even taking into account the way it spread in soft earth, the bear had to be over 500 pounds. The tracks coming toward the cabin were far apart and dug in hard, as if the bear had been running. Running to break in? That didn't make sense. And then he saw boot prints as well, running toward the cabin on the same line as the bear, and it made more sense. David had been outside when the bear attacked, and when he tried to run into the cabin to get his rifle, had nearly made it. Had gotten his hand on the rifle and worked the lever, but the bear was chasing him, was right on him, and after he killed him, had torn the cabin apart. But Anne and Cogwadosh, had they been outside as well? The prints leaving the cabin were more measured, closer together, and he started after them and then stopped, thinking of the rifle, and then shook his head. He was not familiar with firearms and might miss if he ran into the bear. And besides, a broadhead was an incredible weapon when it got inside an animal. He turned away, the bow ready, walking slowly, stopping every few feet and listening for whatever had happened. He thought had happened days before. The condition of David's body and the movement of maggots in the wounds told that. Anne. Susan. He called several times, but knew better. If they hadn't answered when he first yelled, coming to the camp, they weren't going to answer now. There had been 2 younger children as well, a small boy and girl, but he couldn't remember their names. Surely they weren't dead as well. The kennel. There had been 3 or 4 dogs there, not loose, but tied with short chains so they wouldn't rip the gear up. The bear's tracks went at first back to the kennel, and 3 dogs lay dead there, mauled only slightly. A 4th chain was there with a ribbed nylon collar on the end, and he looked back at the dog, which was still following him. That was you. And you ran. But why not stay if Anne and Susan were here? Or the kids? Unless, he thought, unless they were dead. Please no. Just please no, not anymore. Not now. But to the left of the kennel there were bear tracks heading off into the brush, and alongside the tracks there were skid marks as if the bear had been dragging something heavy. No, please no. It was not hard to follow the tracks, and they didn't go very far. 40 yards back in the brush he found the second body, partially eaten. The buttocks and thighs gone, lying on its face, the head hidden by black hair and the rest of the body covered with leaves and dirt as if buried to save for later. Please no. He was sick, but this time did not throw up, and instead squatted by the head of the body and moved the hair away and saw it was Susan's mother, Anne. Her face was not torn, but there was a strange angle to her, as though she had been struck very hard and had broken her neck. He fell back, weakened suddenly, and sat in the grass next to the body. Then he stood and left the body where it was. Time for what had to be done later, when he'd found out about Susan and the other children and moved back to the cabin area. Trying not to think about the bodies, and that was nearly impossible. He forced his mind into a hunting tracking mode and looked for a sign. The water between the island and the main shore was very shallow, never over a couple feet. He quickly found where the bear had waded across and came onto the island shore. Huge tracks in wet mud, then muddy tracks in the grass, moving through low hazel brush up toward the dogs in the kennel, where the bear must have smelled the dog food, fish and beaver meat. The odor could carry with good wind for miles. Everything in him wanted to hurry, to run, to scream her name and run, but Brian forced himself to be slow, to be careful. The bear's tracks were even, just walking, never hurrying until the last moment when he cleared the hazel, and the dog saw him and probably started barking. There, by the kennel, he saw the tracks of two people, one large and one slightly smaller, David and Anne, and there was a dented bucket. They were probably feeding the dogs. The distance line of hazel brush to where they were standing wasn't 10 yards, 30 feet. 3 bounds for a bear, and he was on them. 2 seconds warning, at the most, and he was there, on top of them. Dogs screaming, one blow for Anne, and Brian could see where her body hit. Then David running for the only hope he had, the rifle in the cabin. The bear's prints wheeling and digging as he went after David and the rest of the cabin. Then bear tracks back to the kennel, where he must have killed the dogs. All but one, the one with Brian, and then more tracks, bear tracks, around where Anne's body had fallen, and the skid marks where the bear had dragged Anne away into the brush to feed. No other new tracks. No small children tracks by the kennel or from kennel to house. No tracks of Susan. No newer tracks at all. Maybe she was gone to town, visiting friends or relatives back in the world, gone with children. He started a circle search around the center of activity, the attack site and cabin, looping through the brush, close in at first, moving out 4 feet with each loop, looking intently, studying carefully each stick, each blade of grass, and then on the 10th loop he found it, and then felt stupid for not having seen it once. On the trail up from the lake, just to the side, 2 scuff marks as of somebody walking, somebody smaller than Brian, smaller than David, had suddenly stopped and then run, frantically back down to the bank, and there was more skid marks where the canoe had been shoved away from the bank, and here, hidden in the small grass at odd angles, lay 2 canoe paddles. They must have been fallen from the canoe when she flipped it over and pushed it into the lake. She'd had no paddles, must have used her hands. And then at the side, more bear tracks, where the bear had run down to the shore and then moved sideways along the bank, probably following the canoe for a short distance. On the ground by the first scuff mark was a small 2-quart bucket, and scattered around it were raspberries. Susan. No smaller tracks, no children's tracks. She had been off in the canoe along with the shore picking raspberries and hadn't been there at the time of the attack. 2 canoes. He shook his head and winced at his own ignorance. Of course they had 2 canoes. All the gear and people couldn't travel in one. Susan had taken the other canoe and gone berry picking, either on the shore or other end of the island. Had come back later, after the bear had fed or before, but after the attack and the bear had surprised her. No, seen her coming and gone to meet her and then chased her back to the canoe and then out into the water. There were bear tracks and soft mud of the bank off the south side that he'd missed before when he'd first arrived and went to a considerable distance out of sight. So, the bear had attacked, maybe fed on Anne, but still been around, perhaps rummaging further in the cabin when Susan returned from berry picking. Perhaps she called, sensing something was wrong, and the bear had heard her and gone after her, but she was close to the canoes and had gotten back in and out of the water, into apparently deep enough water before the bear could get to her. Fast. She'd been fast. The bear had cut the corner and not run the trail, which explained why Brian hadn't seen the tracks coming up when he first arrived, but she still beat him. God, he thought, she must have been terrified. Worse. Far worse. She had no idea about her parents. But why hadn't she come back? It had been 2-3 days judging by the fly eggs and worms, and she still wasn't there. And where were the smaller ones? Brian hadn't seen any of their tracks, nor, he swallowed uneasily, any signs that they'd been nearby when the bear attacked. Had the bear gotten Susan and the children, taken them somewhere else? Come on, he said to the dog, stay with me. He moved at a trot down the shoreline of the island, the dog now slightly in the lead heading south, and the bear tracks lined out in front of him along the bank, through the willows and the hazel brush, but always close to the shoreline. Now and then the tracks lunged at the water, then back. God, he was playing with Susan. She was working the canoe along the shore, trying to get away from the bear and get back to camp from the other side, and the bear was playing with her, teasing her, jumping toward her whenever she came too close to shore. All around the island and then off. She must have hand paddled toward the main shore, and when Brian waded across the shallow water, he saw where the bear had followed her down to the main shoreline as well. But then after 100 yards or so, the bear had tired of the game and stopped and moved back in the direction of the island, but up into the trees and harder ground to tight grass, and Brian lost his trail there. All right, then why didn't she come back to the island? Or a better question, why did the bear stop following her along the shore? Brian came up with 2 reasons. First, she had moved away from the shore, out into the lake, and with only her hands to paddle, she could not move the canoe well. If a wind came up, even a small wind, it would blow her where it wanted, and if she was lucky, it would blow her out into the lake, away from the bear. If she had been unlucky and the wind blew the canoe into shore, he shook the thought off. The second reason she might have stayed away from the island was it became dark. Paddling by hand, splashing and clawing, trying to move possibly against the wind and making all the noise in the world, there is no way she could bring herself to approach the island in the dark with the bear probably waiting for her. No way. So she worked her way into the deep part of the lake, or more probably the wind took her, the prevailing north wind, and blew all night to the south end of the lake, into the large marsh and willows and swamps Brian had come through. He might have passed not too far from her on his way north, or she might have blown to shore on the east side, and there she might be. Without a paddle, she could never get the canoe back north, and it would be suicide to try and work by foot along the bank with no weapon. He stopped, looked at the shoreline and the dog. Her whimpering had stopped and her hair was down. The bear was nowhere near. He would have to go back, get his canoe, find Susan. She had to be somewhere south on the lake, trying to work north, trying to get back. He started jogging, the dog keeping close to his side. Evening was coming, and part of him knew that he should bury Anne and David, but he knew he would have to wait. They had to find Susan, find out what happened to the children before the bear. They found her just before dark. He and the dog had been walking the shoreline, scanning the edge of the water and peering out toward the center of the lake, and kept a wary eye of the edge of the woods. She was 4 miles down the lake on the east shore, dragging the canoe along the shallows of the lake so she could jump in and push out if she saw the bear. He saw Susan long before she saw him because he was watching the dog and saw when she lifted her nose, catching the scent of someone, familiar and loved. Susan was intent on watching the thick foliage of the shoreline. When she was just 100 yards away, he called, "Susan!" And it startled her so much that she jumped into her canoe as if to hide, and then got closer, saw she was half crazed with fear and exhaustion, and he understood. He had felt the fear himself and probably hadn't slept in 2 or 3 days and nights. "It's me, Brian. You don't know me, but I spent some time with your family." He pulled up alongside her canoe and held the two together. "Bear," she said. Her hair was matted, and there were scratches on her face and arms. She had been in the water so long she couldn't speak without her teeth chattering. "Bear, I know. Here, wrap in this and go to sleep. I'll pull you back." Brian took his sleeping bag and reached across into her canoe and wrapped her in it, and forced her to lie in the bottom while he tied a line to her bow, fed it back, and started paddling, pulling her canoe behind him. The dog jumped into the first canoe, settling near Susan, who didn't notice her presence through the crushing exhaustion that overtook her as soon as she sat down. It was into dark by this time, and there was a stout evening north wind and a chop. It would take 5 or 6 hours to pull the 2 canoes against the wind back to the island. Good. She needed the rest. She did not know about her parents yet, or had only guessed, and when she found out, it would be terrible for her. Any rest she could get now would be a godsend.